Little Kitty's Knitting Needles by the Reverend P.B. Power. Read by Franklin Habit. A note on the text, from the reader to the listener. The story you are about to hear is presented exactly as it was published in 1881, without abridgment or revision. It would be reasonable to ask why I've recorded Little Kitty's Knitting Needles at all. The author, the Reverend P.B. Power, is not well known today even among the most rabid fans of literary Victoriana. And this story, come to that, is not even well known to the most rabid fans of the Reverend P.B. Power. Little Kitty's theology is out of fashion. Its merit as a work of art is questionable. Its use of the word heathen in reference to non-Christians, and of a common slur against the Romani, which, please be advised, is preserved in the text, is deplorable. Its presentation of social and economic inequality as picturesque, inevitable, and even romantic, well, I'll let the listener be the judge. Therefore, the reasonable question: why record it? Why not let it crumble to dust on the shelf? The first answer is obvious. As a professional knitter and textile artist, my special interest has always been the history of textiles, especially of handmade textiles. Little Kitty's Knitting Needles is an interesting, if minor, part of that history. It belongs to the enormous corpus of didactic Victorian children's literature, intended to save tiny souls through storytelling. And hand knitting, which truly was a vital part of the economy of northern England well into the onset of the Industrial Revolution, is central to its plot from beginning to end. The second answer is perhaps more surprising. In a way, the underlying themes of Little Kitty remain surprisingly relevant to a 21st century audience. Power uses knitting to underscore his Sunday school lessons about industry, idleness, and charity, about the brevity and fragility of human life, about goodness and wickedness, and redemption and damnation. And of course, the shape and style of popular ethics have shifted enormously in the century plus since Little Kitty was first printed. However, the notion of knitting as a means of personal growth, an escape from misery, and a bridge to connection with our fellow human beings, well, that remains as popular as ever, and for good reason. Odd as it may seem, you may recognize a bit of your own story in the tale of Little Kitty. Chapter 1. In the north of England, about the borders of Lancashire, Yorkshire, and Westmoreland, there live a number of highly respectable yeomen who are possessed of small properties of their own. These little properties have been handed down from father to son, in some instances, for many generations, and the different families seem to be almost part and parcel of the soil itself. But now many of these families are breaking up, and the little estates are purchased by neighboring proprietors and absorbed into their large properties. It is in this part of England we are going to lay the scene of our story, which, as you perceive, is called Little Kitty's Knitting Needles. And very beautiful is this part of our country. Hill and dale, wood and river diversify the scene, and the church spires and towers, peeping up here and there, lead us to hope that amid this beautiful scenery there may be found something more beautiful still. Even souls knowing and loving God, and living for a world fairer and more beautiful than all the loveliness around. There are districts in that part of the country that are famous for knitting. Almost everyone handles the pricks, as the knitting needles are called. Knitting is part of the business of life, and part of its pleasures. There are even knitting parties, and no end of gossip at them. And in fact, knitting forms a prominent part of the thoughts, words, and deeds of the female part of these good people's lives. Amongst these yeomen lived a worthy man and his wife, who farmed about 40 acres of land. They were industrious and thrifty. They lived happily together and were a good father and mother to a large family of boys and girls. and if only their little estate had been clear from debt, their hearts would have been as light as the lark's when she soars to heaven in the clear morning air, leaving behind her a more glorious train than ever adorned a monarch in his court, a train of clear and melodious song. But John Bulwer had one great trouble upon his heart, and happy as he and his wife Mary were together, this trouble kept them awake many a night. Their little estate was heavily in debt, not indeed through any fault of theirs, for they had ever been prudent and thrifty, but it had been handed down to them with heavy encumbrances, and they did not know the moment when the lawyer, in whose power they were, would turn them out. When John Bulwer sowed a crop, he often sighed and said to himself, "Who knows who will reap this crop?" When he did any little job about the house, the strokes of the hammer were as though they knocked against his own heart, as he said, "Who can tell for whom I am doing this?" At length the evil day really came. One morning the postman who went round that way left a letter for poor John, and it contained a notice from the lawyer to pay up the mortgage or the money lent on the security of the farm, and unless it was paid within 6 months, the farm was to be sold. There was sore distress in John Bulwer's house when the contents of this letter became known, for there was no doubt but that the farm must go. Looking forward to this evil day, the worthy yeoman had often tried to raise the money, but he could not. And now he felt that in a few months the old homestead must be left, and he must go forth into the wide world. Never did 6 months pass so quickly for the poor Bulwers as those succeeding the day of notice, and at last the evil time drew near, and the farm was put up to auction. It fetched less than was expected. Some of the interest could not be paid. Then followed a sale of the poor man's furniture, and, as he himself anticipated, he was thrown out upon the wide world. John Bulwer's good conduct and kind, neighborly ways secured him many friends in this sad state of affairs. Everyone pitied him, and many were willing to do what they could for him. But as almost all had large families to support, and only too many were themselves laden with debt, they could not do much. The worthy yeoman was grateful for all kindness, but he was not the man to eat the bread of idleness or charity when he could work, so he speedily cast about him as to what he was to do. A very humble cottage at the foot of a neighboring hill was to be had for a trifling rent, and that he hired for a dwelling, and a situation offered by a neighboring farmer promised to give him just bread enough for his little ones. John Bulwer was to be a kind of head man over the farm, turning his hand to whatever was wanted, superintending the men, and giving a general eye to his master's interests. For a while all went tolerably well in the little cottage, but there was more trouble at hand. Scarlet fever broke out in the family, and swept away one after another of the children, until, when the disease had passed away from the house, it was found that but one child was left, and that one the weakest of the little party. Kitty Bulwer had never been strong, but she survived the fever when all the rest had been laid low in their graves. Little reader, rejoice not in your strength. Say not, I am too strong and too well to be near death. I will think about my soul when I come to die. Oh, how soon the strongest are laid low! Disease may soon take away all your strength. In one day or one night you may be reduced to such a state of weakness as not to be able to stand or speak. Preparations for another world should never be put off because we are strong and well. So little Kitty was the only one left, and upon her the fierce disease left its mark, for during her illness her hands became contracted, so that she was not able for a considerable time to help herself in the least. In the midst of all this loss, John Bulwer murmured not. He said, "The Lord gave, and the Lord hath taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." He read about Job, the man of patience, and still better he read about Jesus, the man of sorrows. And he said, "The disciple is not above his master." And he bowed his head, and amid all his trials gave thanks to God. Very grateful indeed were the stricken parents that their little daughter Kitty had been spared to them. True, her hands were a pitiable sight, and she was evidently very delicate and probably would continue so all her life. Still, she was their child, and not to be left altogether childless was a great mercy. Some persons are ever thinking of how much they have lost, and never look at what has been spared. Because the clouds are thick, they shut their eyes to the little rays of sunshine which break through them, and thus they miss the alleviation and comfort which may generally be found even amid very sore trials. What is there so bad, but that it might have been worse? Mr. and Mrs. Bulwer often went on Sunday, which was their only day of leisure, to look at the graves of their 5 little darlings, all lying side by side in the churchyard, and there they dropped many a warm tear. But often also they stood over little Kitty's humble bed at night, and watched her heavenly countenance as she slept, and then they shed a tear of gratitude and joy as they looked on her and thought that they had one child left. Little reader, always have an eye for your mercies. If you have one eye for your sorrows, and who can help seeing trials and troubles when they come upon him, have the other for your mercies, and you will find that your heart will thus, by God's grace, be kept from sinful repining, and have a spring for exertion, and strength for endurance until the time of the trial be overpast. No one who knew little Kitty Bulwer would have been the least surprised at the delight her parents took in her. She was obedient, gentle, cheerful, and loved God, and showed that love in her daily life. Ever had Kitty a cheerful word and smile, and the light danced in her bright eyes just as the sunbeams do in the rippling mountain streams. Kitty's great grief in life was her crippled hands. She had been very useful about the house before the scarlet fever attacked her. She had delighted in helping her mother in her daily household work, and her heart sunk at the idea of being always useless, always an encumbrance, unable to do anything to earn a trifle to help in the expenses of the house. It is very true, little Kitty knew how to knit. Almost the very babies round about knew how to knit. And such an intelligent little girl as she was not likely to be behindhand. But what good was this, seeing that her poor fingers were now so contracted and indeed almost twisted that they could not hold the pricks any more? She could not grasp the thin needles with her contorted fingers, and without knitting needles, it was of course impossible to knit. Often did Kitty lie awake at night pondering over her sad affliction and thinking, "What can I possibly do to help my father and mother?" At one time, she fancied that she could in some way tie the pricks to her fingers, and when that failed, she got some cobbler's wax and tried to stick them there. But it was all in vain. The steel needles seemed determined to have no more to do with Kitty, and at length she was obliged to give up her experiments in despair. But though obliged to give up her experiments on the steel needles, she still continued to ponder in her mind whether something could not be done, and at last a bright idea flashed across her mind. True, she could not hold steel knitting needles, but as her fingers had not lost all their power, perhaps she might be able to do something with larger ones, the only drawback to this idea being the coarseness of such work. All around her were knitting fine articles, and for them they procured a ready sale. Would work done with coarse needles sell at all? "I can never know unless I try," said Kitty. "And if only I have a blessing on my efforts, I shall do well, despite all my disadvantages." With Kitty Bulwer, this was the grand point. She observed that, in spite of many days of sharp winds, the little lambs throve and grew into sheep, and also that with all the vicissitudes of the weather the crops came to perfection. "And surely," said she, "I can do a great deal, and my work can prosper, if only it have a blessing from on high." This idea of the blessing gradually became a very prominent one in little Kitty's mind, and the more she thought about it, and the more she prayed for it, the more did she expect it, and great things from it. A neighboring carpenter, who had a great regard for Kitty's father, was made the little girl's confidant, and he promised to make her some needles of wood. Kitty visited him at his shop, and he tried her hands to see how small and fine a needle she could hold, and sent her away with the joyful intelligence that she should have them ready for work by the following Monday morning. Kitty's father and mother fell very readily into her plans, and provided her with some coarse wool. They were only too delighted to find that she could occupy herself usefully in any way. They knew that idle time hangs heavy upon the hands, and they remembered, good as Kitty was, that what the Christian poet had written was true. For Satan finds some mischief still for idle hands to do. The head full of knowledge, the heart full of love, and the hands full of work, and thus, with the blessing of God, we may be kept out of much evil. It is a mistake to suppose that idleness is happiness. Very few are more truly miserable than the idle, and it is well known by medical men that idleness will even make people ill. It gives them what the French call ennui, and when people are troubled with ennui, they get cross, and do not know what to do with themselves, and become fretful both in body and mind, many a time fancying themselves a prey to all sorts of diseases and trials. Kitty Bulwer would always have found something to do, but to have a regular resource like this was quite a bright prospect. It required some practice on Kitty's part to be able to hold the needles, and her first attempts at knitting were very awkward. But she soon got used to the wooden needles and by degrees became quite handy at her work. Even in the humblest spheres of life, we are liable to trials and troubles which will test our Christian character. And humble as Kitty Bulwer's position now was, she found herself tried in it. Kitty Bulwer's rough work could not, of course, for one moment be compared with the fine knitting done in the neighborhood around, and indeed she did not pretend that it could. She did not exhibit it to any person, much less make a boast of it. Still, she found trouble in this humble work. The carpenter who befriended her and made her needles had a daughter whose name was Nancy, and this Nancy was not a well-disposed girl. So long as she could have everything her own way, she seemed amiable enough, but as Nancy could not always have her own way any more than other people, we need not be surprised at hearing that she was very often out of temper. Nancy Sawyer was full of self-conceit. She was also jealous and selfish, and in fact had in her character many elements of misery for others and herself. Just now, this unamiable girl was very wroth with Kitty Bulwer. It so happened that she wanted her father to turn an old box into a rabbit hutch for her, while he was engaged in making little Kitty Bulwer's knitting needles. And because he would not put by his work and turn at once to hers, she flew into a dreadful passion. "You never do anything for me," cried Nancy Sawyer, "although I am your own daughter. But any brat that comes in the way and wheedles you, you'll do anything they like." "Nancy, Nancy," said the carpenter, "think before you say such an untruth. Didn't I mend your hoe and spade for you the other day, almost as soon as you gave them to me?" Aye, cried Nancy, "because you wanted me to work in the garden. That was for you as well as for myself. But you won't make me this hutch that I only want for myself." "'Tis true," answered the carpenter, "that I hurried with your hoe and spade because you wanted them for a useful purpose. And now I am hurrying with Kitty Bulwer's knitting needles because it's a useful job, and indeed, more than that, it is an important one to her." Aye, but Kitty is not your daughter, and I think you ought to help your own daughter before anyone else." "Nancy," answered the carpenter, "we may be selfish in what we do for our own relations, as well as in what we do for ourselves, and I should be selfish if, to please you, I took your plaything in hand before these necessary things for a sick neighbor." "I hope they'll never come to any good," passionately screamed out the wicked girl in a high tone of voice, "and I don't believe that they will. What can a twisted-fingered creature like her do with knitting needles? I don't believe she'll ever make a sixpence with all her knitting." And so saying, Nancy Sawyer flung herself out of her father's workshop in a great rage. The carpenter was a kind-hearted man, but he was sorely in fault in not correcting his daughter. The consequence was, her temper grew worse and worse, and she promised fair to be a plague to him as well as to herself. Contenting himself with not doing the hutch and keeping on at the knitting needles, the carpenter took no more notice of his daughter's passion. But the matter did not pass so easily out of Nancy's mind. This evil girl determined to spite Kitty whenever she could, and many were the plans for doing so which she turned over in her mind. Meanwhile, Kitty Bulwer was turning over many plans in her mind as to what she should do with the produce of her work. Two great objects she had in view, and as her father had told her that she might have for herself whatever she was able to earn, she determined to divide her earnings between the two great aims she wished to carry out. One of Kitty's great desires was to add something to her father and mother's comfort. The other was to be able to send something to the missionaries, in whose work she had taken the liveliest interest almost ever since she could understand anything. There was to be one stocking out of each pair for Kitty's father and mother, and another stocking for the missionaries. And if only her work were blessed, Kitty hoped to do great things. "Great things indeed," perhaps some of our young readers exclaim. "How could she be so foolish as to expect that? Perhaps she might do something, but to expect to do great things is rather too much. If Kitty could give a donation of £1,000, or even £50 a year, she might do something great, but not with the humble means at her disposal." But, strange as it may appear, Kitty Bulwer really did aspire to doing something great. It was one of her great encouragements in thus trying to make use of her crippled fingers that she might be eminently useful, and she thus reasoned with herself. "One half of my money is to buy Bibles to send to the heathen. If my money is forthcoming, there will be so many the more Bibles, perhaps a dozen, or say but half a dozen. And as each heathen will get only one Bible, there will be a supply of the Holy Book for 6 more persons than there would have been if I had not given my money. If I ask a blessing upon those 6 Bibles, who can tell but that they may be the means of the conversion of 6 souls? And would it not be worth even a whole lifetime of labor to be the instrument of bringing 6 souls to the glory, of rescuing them from the fearful horrors of the lost?" Thus reasoned Kitty Bulwer with herself, and she determined, with God's blessing, to succeed. "I will try," said she, "again and again, until I am able to knit with those needles, even if it took me years before I succeeded." A very useful lesson does little Kitty teach us all. How apt we are to think that we cannot do anything. One says, "I am too young," another, "I am too poor," another, "I am too small," and so on. Few comparatively remembering that God requires from a man according to what he hath, and not according to what he hath not. Everyone can do something in God's kingdom, and to promote his glory, and oftentimes he uses the very feeblest instruments to bring about the end he would have accomplished. But the great point is to be determined. If we make up our minds that, with God's blessing, we will do what is right, he will help us in carrying out that determination. We must do our part. He will not fail in doing his. Dear young reader, sometimes remember poor little Kitty Bulwer with her twisted fingers and think, what can I do? And be determined to do it. End of Chapter 1. Chapter 2. After many attempts, the young knitter succeeded very well, and great was her joy, and great also the delight of her parents when she exhibited to them the first pair of finished stockings. The carpenter also was highly delighted. He was rejoiced that his needles had done so well, and his benevolent heart was glad as he thought that he had been the means of benefiting a fellow creature. Several of the neighbors also came in, and shared in the family joy, and spoke encouragingly to Kitty of her work. Many of them thought that it would have been quite a disgrace for a woman or girl not to be able to handle the pricks, and so they also, even though they rejoiced on no higher ground, were yet well pleased. There was only one person who was not pleased, and that was Nancy Sawyer. That evil-minded girl had been for a long time on the watch to do Kitty Bulwer some harm, and was sorely grieved that as yet no opportunity had been afforded her. True, she had been able to give some vent to her spite, for when Kitty sat knitting on the sunny side of a neighboring hedge, singing now and again snatches of her favorite hymns, she used to come and twit her about her failures, and mock at her twisted fingers. At times, she used to contort her own fingers into strange twisted shapes, and hold them up before Kitty's face, and then she used to pretend to try and knit in an awkward fashion. But she had been obliged to content herself with these evil ways. She dared not really lift a hand against her little neighbor. Nevertheless, Nancy Sawyer kept constantly in view her intention of playing Kitty as scurvy a trick as she could, and the great desire of her mind was to get hold of the newly finished pair of stockings, and to destroy them if she could. "That will be tenfold better," said Nancy, "than hindering her as she goes on. That will bring all her work to nothing in a moment. That will pay her out for all I owe her, and I shall have my revenge." In the course of a little time, Nancy Sawyer got the opportunity she desired. Kitty Bulwer's new stockings were lying on the window-sill of her cottage, and Nancy spied them as she passed by that way. Cautiously did she peep through the window to see if anyone were at hand, and when she had made fully sure of the rooms being empty, she took her scissors from her pocket and gave the stockings several small cuts. Then, with a horrible smile upon her mouth, she crept off as quietly as she could. When Nancy Sawyer had fairly made her escape and was out in the fields, she put her hands to her sides and threw back her head and burst out in a loud fit of laughter. "Ha, ha!" cried she. "I've done for you now, my fine lady. You'll stand in the way of my hutches again, won't you? I think I've paid you off pretty handsomely now. Ha, ha, ha!" And Nancy roared out with laughter again. Nancy Sawyer's heart was glad for the moment. She had just such happiness as the devils have when they are able to do mischief, and indeed she had just yielded herself as an instrument to Satan, to do what he desired. Whoever spites another is thereby doing the evil spirit's work. Malice, spite, revenge are all the devil's delight, and let no young reader of this story yield himself or herself to Satan, a ready instrument to do his will. Is not the very thought of such a thing horrible? The bare idea of being an instrument of the devil ought to make us shudder, and deter us from rendering evil for evil. When Kitty Bulwer discovered her misfortune, her little heart was almost broken. A kind neighbor who was going to the next town where the stockings were generally bought called in for Kitty's pair. The good woman had all along taken an interest in the child's efforts, and had promised to do her best to sell her stockings together with her own, and although no one knew it, she had even made up her mind to buy the stockings herself if she could not find a purchaser. "'Tis a brave thing," said this honest woman, "for that young creature to work so hard with those crippled fingers, and I'll be bound she has some good way in her head of spending what she earns. If she does get some of my money, it won't go to any bad use. Someone will be the better for it." Mrs. Wilson was a right cheery woman, one who was always glad to do good to others, one who made the best of everything as it turned up, and now, humming a tune, she made her appearance at Kitty Bulwer's house. "Here I am," said Mrs. Wilson, throwing down a large bundle. "Here is all my girl's fine work going into town, and I'm come for your coarse stockings, Kitty. Fine capital stockings for some big giant. Why, one pair of them would make a dozen of ours." "Folk think your stockings won't sell," said Mrs. Wilson, "but I'm sure they will. I think I know somebody will buy them. They're capital for any rheumatic or gouty people, for drawing on over the others. I never saw any of these in the market, so you'll have the market all to yourself. And who knows, Kitty, but you'll get a name for coarse stockings and make a fortune in the end." Kitty laughed at the idea of the fortune, and laid hold of her stockings to put them up in paper. "Stop, stop," said Mrs. Wilson. "Let me run my eye over them. I should like to know well what I'm recommending. I must be able to say, I know they're good work." Kitty handed her friend the stockings, and fixed her eyes upon her, hoping to see a look of approbation upon her face. Mrs. Wilson was herself one of the best knitters in the neighborhood, therefore her opinion would be worth something, and in Kitty's mind, if it were favorable, she felt pretty sure that the stockings would be sold. Judge, therefore, of her distress when she saw Mrs. Wilson's eyebrows lifted up, and then when she perceived a frown gathering upon her brow. "They're as good as I could make them, indeed. I've done my best," sobbed Kitty as she burst into tears, for Mrs. Wilson had steadily fixed her eyes upon the stockings, and was evidently in a high state of displeasure. "You have done your best, I believe you, my poor child," said her friend, "and the stockings are as well knitted as if you had been paid £1,000 for doing them. But look here," and she showed poor Kitty the little cuts in the wool. How did these come here? When Kitty saw the cuts, her little heart was fit to break. In a moment all her golden visions of the Bibles for the missionaries and help for her father vanished from her mind, and she felt as if this calamity would quite crush her spirit. "Come, Kitty, we must not waste our time in crying over the matter. There is some mystery here. These are the cuts of some sharp instrument, and as they are in more places than one, my belief is that they have not come here by accident. We must unravel this mystery. What has happened once may happen perhaps again, and 'twill never do to knit stockings to have them cut in pieces in this way. If these stockings have been cut by design, the person that cut them must have wished to do you some harm. That's quite plain. Now, who is there hereabouts that has ever tried to do you any harm?" "The only one that was ever unkind to me," sobbed Kitty, "was Nancy Sawyer. But I have no reason to think she cut the stockings. Indeed, I don't know that she has been this way at all. Oh dear, it was a cruel thing to do." "We must try and find out more about it," said Mrs. Wilson. "But meanwhile, let us not be idle. I never like to lose any time in useless fretting. Let us see what we can do to repair the loss. The best thing you can do, Kitty, is to set about a new pair of stockings at once. They'll be ready against next market day, and you shan't want for wool, for I'll buy these stockings from you for the price of the wool. I want a piece of net for our fruit trees, and this will just do to make it. So you can start again, and everything will turn out for the best. If you asked a blessing on your work, not even this sad misfortune can prevent its coming. Now, goodbye." And Mrs. Wilson took her departure with a great many thoughts in her head, leaving poor Kitty standing at the cottage door, with a great many tears in her eyes. "I'll unravel this mystery," said Mrs. Wilson to herself, "even if it costs £10. And ruminating on the matter, turning it over again and again in her mind, she trudged along to the market town. The triumphing of the wicked is often destined to be but short. An eye is upon them when they do not think it, and their evil is brought to light. So was it in the present case. Nancy Sawyer was destined to be discovered in a very unexpected way. As Mrs. Wilson was going to the market town with her bundle of knitting, her way lay through the very field where Nancy Sawyer had been giving vent to her delight and exultation at having successfully accomplished her evil deed. And as she walked along, she saw a poor old man, and apparently his little daughter, lying in a hedge by the wayside. Mrs. Wilson was not the woman to pass by anyone in distress without a kind word, so she stopped and spoke to the poor people. The old man said he had had very little to eat that day, and indeed, said he, we have not met with anyone who would give us anything. The only person we have seen this way was a girl that we thought was mad, and she frightened my poor child here almost out of her very wits. Mrs. Wilson's curiosity was a good deal stirred at this. She did not know of anyone's being insane in the neighborhood, so she put a few questions to the poor people to find out some more about the matter. "What kind of girl was she?" asked Mrs. Wilson. "A tall, slouching-looking girl, with a red handkerchief crossed on her breast, and a straw bonnet with a yellow faded ribbon." "Why, sure," said Mrs. Wilson, "it must have been Nancy Sawyer, but she's not mad." "And what did she say or do to frighten you, my child?" asked Mrs. Wilson. "Why, she was so wild-like," answered the little girl. "She didn't see us, for we were lying at the other side of the hedge under yon ferns, but she talked to herself, and threw herself about, and was quite mad-like. I couldn't hear all she said, for we were not close enough, but she was saying she had done for somebody, and she cried out, 'Ha, ha, ha,' very often." "As far as we could make out," chimed in the old man, "somebody had angered her, and she had been spiting the person, and had her revenge, and she was delighted at whatever she had done." "Oh, oh," said Mrs. Wilson to herself, "I'm on the scent now. That girl was Nancy Sawyer, and I expect she has been cutting Kitty Bulwer's stockings." And so saying, she gave a couple of pence to these poor folk, and went on her way. End of Chapter 2. Chapter 3. When Mrs. Wilson returned from the market town, she came back by Kitty's cottage. The little girl had expected to have received her first earnings just at this time, so it was a sore trial to her to see Mrs. Wilson without having her hopes realized. There was a smile, however, on that good woman's face, which made Kitty feel sure that she had something interesting to tell. "I have it all," said Mrs. Wilson. "There can be little doubt that Nancy Sawyer did all the mischief. That's the way she took to spite you. I'll go to her father and get her such a thrashing as will do her good for the rest of her life." It was some time before Kitty Bulwer could fully persuade herself that Nancy Sawyer could have been guilty of so wanton an act of mischief. At last, however, she came to be of Mrs. Wilson's opinion. "I fear," said she, after thinking for a long time, "she did it. But don't get her beaten. I'd rather lose the stockings than have her thrashed." Mrs. Wilson could not understand this at all. She thought that a good thrashing was just what Nancy Sawyer deserved, and indeed she went so far as to say that she should have no objection to give it to her herself. "The good-for-nothing hussy," said she, "but she'll suffer for it some way or other." Mrs. Wilson was rather vexed that Kitty would not let her go to the carpenter to get his daughter thrashed. She said, however, that it was Kitty's stockings that had been spoiled, and that it was her affair, and that she would leave it where it was, as such was her wish. And after encouraging Kitty to begin another pair of stockings as soon as she could get the course worsted, she took her leave. No doubt now remained on Kitty Bulwer's mind as to who had injured her work, and she was the more confirmed in her belief by the fact that Nancy Sawyer avoided her as much as she could. That evil girl was not without a conscience, and her conscience would not let her look Kitty in the face. "I must pray for that girl," said Kitty. "We are told to pray for those that despitefully use us." From that day forth, Nancy Sawyer was never an entire day out of Kitty Bulwer's mind. Her one great wish was that she should come to repentance, and not perish at the last. Kitty's parents had the same desire. They could not but feel sorely hurt at their poor child's having been so persecuted, but they were ready to bless them that persecuted them. Sad as poor Kitty's misfortune was, she was not destined to be entirely disappointed in her desires of earning both for the missionaries and her parents. On the other hand, a double blessing was about to be her lot. As the little girl had been so much put back by the loss of the first pair of stockings, she began earnestly to think what she could do to repair the loss. At last, she hit upon a thought. Some little distance from Kitty's cottage lay the coach road, and on that road was a very steep hill. The little girl, whenever she went that way, had observed that the horses generally stopped in the middle of the hill to take breath, and then it was necessary for someone with the carriages to put a stone behind the wheels to prevent their slipping down the hill, especially in frosty weather. As many of the carriages passing that way had no footman, Kitty thought that if she took her pricks and did her work by the roadside, she might be at hand to supply a stone for the wheels, and so might earn some pence. The old man who kept the turnpike at the bottom of the hill agreed to give the child shelter in case of the weather's turning out unexpectedly bad, and it was settled that she should go just when she liked, and stay as long as she pleased. In this matter also the carpenter proved himself a friend. He promised to throw together a rough seat for his little friend, and he suggested that she should have a couple of wedge-shaped pieces of wood, which would be lighter than stone to move, and would answer the purpose more effectually. Besides which, said the carpenter, it will look much better, and be more useful-like, and perhaps when folks see you with your regular tools, they will be more inclined to give you something than if you just put a stone behind their wheels. The carpenter was as good as his word. He soon tossed together a rustic seat, and made the wedges, and Kitty took her place by the roadside one sunshiny morning, with her pricks in her hand and the wedges by her side. Kitty was not discouraged, because at first not many pence came to her lot. Her new stockings were getting on, and she was delivered from the mockings of Nancy Sawyer, and the little she had received would buy wool for 3 or 4 pairs more of her stockings, so she thought she had no cause to complain. There was, however, what some people would call a great piece of good luck in store for Kitty. One day, a traveling carriage with 4 horses dashed through the turnpike and up the hill. The postilions, in all probability, thought to surmount the hill at a gallop, and they whipped and spurred their horses so as to reach the top in a single run. But midway in the hill, the horses found their work too heavy for them, and the leaders, apparently quite blown, stumbled and fell. Kitty was at her post. Had she not been, who could tell what fearful consequences might have ensued? For the carriage was heavily laden with luggage, and the great probability was that it would drag back horses and all down the steep incline. Kitty, as we have said, was at her post, and in a moment her 2 wedges were pushed firmly under the hind wheels. The footman behind shouted to the postilions that it was all right, and then leapt down to help to extricate the horses, and to wait on the occupants of the carriage. They consisted of a lady and her little daughter, and they were both as pale as marble, and their eyes were wet with tears. They felt they had escaped from a great peril indeed. "Please, your ladyship," said the footman, "it is a providence that we have not all been destroyed. We might have been killed but for yonder little girl on that seat." "The horses cannot go on for some time," said the countess. "Put down the steps, Thomas, and let me out, and take out Lady Mary also. Come, Mary darling, and we'll thank the little girl for having been the means of doing so much for us." The little girl, called Lady Mary, was about Kitty's own size, but she was even much more delicate in form. She was thin and pale, and it was quite evident that she was not strong upon her feet. Indeed, her feet were so wrapped up that it was almost hard for her to walk. Young as Lady Mary was, she was a martyr to rheumatism. Her little bones often ached, and it was only by great care that she had been reared. "Thank you, my little girl, 1,000 times," said the countess to Kitty, "for I believe that under Providence you have saved our lives." "Yes, thank you," said Lady Mary. "I am sure we shall never forget you, shall we, mamma?" Kitty curtsied and got very red, for she felt sure she was speaking to some very grand people, and at last she stammered out that she was very glad she had been of any use. "I think, under God, you have saved our lives," said the countess, "and I should like to give you some little acknowledgment of our thankfulness." Whereupon, having drawn a handsome silk purse from her pocket, she took 5 sovereigns from it and put them into Kitty Bulwer's hand. Nothing could have set Kitty more at ease than this mention of the lady's thankfulness to God. "These are good people," thought she to herself, They no doubt love and worship the same God that I do, and now felt less inclined to slip away. By way of putting the child more at her ease, the Countess took up her knitting and began to ask her about it, and Kitty, getting communicative, gave her the whole account of their misfortunes, of the death of her brothers and sisters, of her own illness, and of her efforts to help her parents and the missionaries. I had almost despaired of ever being rich enough to give them any real help, but now I can, said the little girl joyfully, as she looked at the golden coins. You shall not be disappointed in your work, either, said the Countess, who was greatly interested in Kitty's story. I approve highly of your attempt to do something. I always help those whom I find endeavoring to help themselves, and I will buy 12 pairs of your stockings as soon as they are ready. Here, said the Countess, taking a card from her card-case, and writing an address on it with a pencil, is the name of the place where we shall be staying for the next 3 months, and you can bring the stockings when they are done. They are to be a child's size, the size for this little girl. And the Countess told Kitty to measure Lady Mary's foot. My little daughter is subject to rheumatism, and these will do to draw over her feet. By this time the carriage was got to rights, and the footman came forward to announce that all was ready, and in a few moments the handsome vehicle, with its 4 horses, was out of sight. Kitty Bulwer remained by the roadside, almost fancying that all that had just passed was a dream. People don't find golden sovereigns in their hands when they have been dreaming of them, and there was no denying that there they were in Kitty's palm. So she made the best of her way home. As she went along the road, she had some sore temptations about the money. £2 10 seemed to be a great deal to give away, especially for one in her circumstances, and when her dear parents were in want of so many things, and it was suggested to her mind that if she gave 5 shillings, that would do very well, especially as it would be a great deal more than many of the neighbors gave. But Kitty held firm, and after many arguments, and indeed no small contention within herself, she determined that 1/2 should be given. Is it, said she to herself, because God has blessed me above all expectation that I should draw back? I thought to have made a few shillings, and then he should have had the half. And now that I have pounds, shall I do less in proportion? No, said she, £2 10 shall go to the missionaries, and £2 10 to father and mother. The more liberal God is to us, the more liberal should we be in our gifts to him. End of Chapter 3. Chapter 4. The story of Kitty's wonderful adventure soon got abroad through the neighborhood, and everyone except Nancy Sawyer rejoiced at her prosperity. Amongst those who rejoiced most was good Mrs. Wilson. You remember, said she, you asked a blessing on your work, Kitty, and you have received it, only in an unexpected way. All our blessings do not come on the road we expect them to travel, and this one has come a roundabout way. You remember that it is written that all things shall work together for good to them that love God, and thus it has been in your case. And I hear you have an order for 12 pairs, said Mrs. Wilson. Well, that's grand, and if I can give you any help, I will. Kitty Bulwer worked away at her coarse stockings, and was getting on pretty forward with the execution of her order, when a groom rode up to her cottage door. She soon knew whence he came, for he had the same livery on as that worn by the servants of the Countess, and it was from the Countess he had come. The man brought a note to Kitty, saying that the Countess wished her to come at once to the hall where she was staying, and to bring with her as many of the stockings as she had finished. The groom had instructions also to give her 10 shillings to pay her fare by the coach. When Kitty Bulwer arrived at the hall, she was taken to a small room where, laid upon a sofa, was the little girl she had seen on the roadside, the Lady Mary. The little lady was suffering from rheumatism, and now she tried to raise herself on the couch. "We sent for you," said she, "to know if you would teach me to knit. I have been thinking, too, a great deal about your having been the means of saving our lives, and as I wish to try and learn to knit, I should rather learn from you than anyone else. Mamma will give you plenty of money if you teach me, only I am very slow at learning, and you must have a great deal of patience with me. Have you plenty of patience?" Kitty had been told by the housekeeper to call the little girl "my lady," for, said she, her father is a grand lord. So she answered, "My lady, I'll be very glad to teach you to knit, and I hope I can be patient, for it took me a long time before I was handy enough to do any knitting after my hands got bad." "Perhaps it will take me ever so many months," said her little ladyship. "Oh, I don't mind how long, only—" and here Kitty burst into tears. The thought of her father and mother crossed her mind. "Only I should not like to be so long away from my parents." "I'll take care of your parents," said a voice from the door, and at that moment Lady Mary's mother entered. "If only you'll remain with my daughter until she has learned." Then and there was the whole matter settled, and before long Lady Mary let Kitty into her whole secret. "You see," said her ladyship, "that I am now laid here, and although I can often run about, still I am often laid for whole weeks upon my sofa, or perhaps in bed, and then my time does not always pass very quickly, and I often keep thinking that I should be much happier if I had something to do, especially if it were something that would help to make other people happy, so I have made up my mind to learn to knit. And when I have learned to knit, I mean to make a great many stockings for the poor. We have a great many poor people in our neighborhood and on our estate, and it will be a great pleasure to keep them warm in the winter." What a delightful prospect now opened out before Kitty Bulwer, and it became much more delightful when her parents gave their assent to it. And it was settled that Kitty Bulwer should live as knitting teacher and half waiting maid on Lady Mary. "All the waiting I want," said the Countess to Kitty's mother, "can easily be done by your daughter, and if she reads to my child, and they knit together, and she conduces to her happiness, that is all I desire." And thus Kitty became installed for a while as an inmate of a great house. As weeks passed on, Kitty Bulwer became more and more acceptable to the little lady, so much so that Lady Mary could not bear to part with her, and when the situation of farm bailiff became vacant, the Countess gave it to Kitty's father, who came south and lived near his daughter in something like his former house again. Years rolled on, and Kitty Bulwer had grown into a strong woman, when one day as she was returning to the castle in the frosty twilight of Christmas, she was accosted by a gypsy-like woman with a wretched-looking child upon her back and 2 more following her. Kitty was very respectably, though not finely, dressed, and the woman took her for one of the ladies of the castle. "Oh, listen to me, my lady," said she, "and give me something to cover my feet. They're frost-bitten, and I feel as though my toes would drop off. And the children are as bad. My husband is dead. Aye, he died in a ditch, off cold, not a month ago, and I'll soon go too." "If you go up to the castle yard, I'll relieve you," said Kitty. "I'll go on and get something warm for you." And hastening home, she took out the last pair of socks she had knitted, and got some warm soup from the kitchen. The woman was at the door, and when she and the children had devoured the soup, she stretched out her hand eagerly for the stockings. But she no sooner saw them plainly than she fixed her eyes on Kitty, and then with a loud scream she fell fainting on the ground. When the strange woman came to herself, she thrust out her hand violently, as though she were pushing someone from her, and cried out Kitty's name several times. Who or what could she be? Whence had she come? Kitty ventured close to her, while one of the servants threw a light strong upon her face, and in a moment the truth was revealed. The wretched woman was Nancy Sawyer. It was too much, even for her, to receive the stockings from one whom she had wronged in former times. Kitty begged the servants to withdraw and leave the strange woman with her, and in a short time she heard from her her whole story. She confessed to having cut the stockings, and ever since she had done that malicious deed she had no peace. Things seemed always to go wrong with her. In spite of her father's disapproval, Nancy had married a traveling tinker and knife grinder, and had wandered about half-starved over the country for many a long day. A comfortable place was provided by the Countess's direction in one of the out-offices for the poor vagrant, and Kitty Bulwer intended on the following morning to give her some substantial help. But when morning came, the vagrant was not to be found. Lying close to where she had slept were the stockings which had been laid for her, and it was supposed that, sore as was her need, she could not take them when she remembered the past. No more was ever heard of Nancy Sawyer, but a person answering her description was transported for theft. But Kitty Bulwer lived on, honored and respected at the castle, finding out more and more every day how all things work together for good to those who love God. End of story. This recording was read by Franklin Habit and is dedicated to his Patreon patrons who made the work possible. Thank you. Copyright 2021, all rights reserved. Thank you for watching. If you've enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing to my channel so you'll be the first to know about future episodes. Click like or leave me a comment to let me know your thoughts. And if you really liked what you saw, check out my Patreon campaign, where my patrons enjoy exclusive access to downloads, live streams, and other bonus material every week.